Hey guys, Elvenpins here, back with, for the first time in a few months, a D&D subclass video. Not subclass, ranking. You know what I mean. And you know when you come here you're getting low quality shit. Anyway, we're going to be covering the athlete from Mythic Odysseys of Theros and the Charlatan from PHB.
The athlete background is found on page 31 in Mythic Odysseys of Theros book. Um, and it's essentially just a background that gives you access to the ability to just be an athlete of any kind. You can be a marathoner, you can work in wrestling, you could be a charioteer, and you could also just work as a full armor hoplite as you go around the battlefield. It's very versatile in terms of what it really considers an athlete to be, but it's also Greek, and that's basically what they were. If you are an athlete, then the skill proficiencies that you get will be both acrobatics and athletics. And then you also get one language of your choice, proficiency with land vehicles in case you go around charioting, and the equipment you get is a bronze discus, a lucky charm, and a past trophy, as well as some traveler's clothes and a small pouch containing 10 gold pieces.
This isn't a bad setup. Well, you may not run into land vehicles very often. When you do, it's annoying when someone in your party doesn't have the proficiency in them.
Yeah, it's also very useful just in general chase situations if you need to hop on a car from the top of a building and just start gunning. Obviously, that's not going to happen in every game, but if your DM is nice, then you can probably make use of that acrobatics to leap tall buildings in a single bound. There's that athletics.
Yeah.
The,
With
the
this,
other really nice.
with this,
Yeah.
you get a flavored event that you particularly are good in. You roll a d8 on a table, and or you can choose anything within your DM's allowance. The options are a marathon, long distance running, pretty similar, wrestling, boxing, chariot or horse racing, the pancration, mixed of unarmed combat, a hoplite race, full full unit racing in a set of armor, and the pentathlon, running, long jump, discus, javelin, and wrestling. One of the oldest events in the Olympics.
And it seems like just a hodgepodge of absolutely everything. The big feature that you get for being an athlete is called Echoes of Victory. It essentially says that if you're within 50 miles of your hometown, or basically where you've generally competed last, um, there is about a 50-50 shot that someone there is going to be a person who admires you and will be willing to help give you information about the local area and also a bit of temporary shelter. Two really useful things for basically any DM.
Yeah, it's more or less the uh, feature that Folk Hero gets. We will be covering that one eventually. And it does have a small thing that says you will have to occasionally go for the practicing the profession downtime found in Chapter 8 of the Player's Handbook.
I think it also just sort of noting that it is a profession that you can take from a background, such that, like, in the case that you're a charlatan or you're a folk hero, well, you definitely can do stuff in your free time. It isn't like 100% defined, but this background is like a legitimate job that people would do, such as like just being an athlete, and you would get paid for it. So it also just gives you something to do to earn cash in your free time.
Next is a suggested characteristics. We hear what we do, if you haven't been here before. We
One die.
don't list all of them, we just list ones that we find particularly interesting and the number that would come up on a die to facilitate that result.
Starts off with personality traits. My favorite characteristic out of all of them is number 8. I get irritated if people praise someone else and not me. I just think it's absolutely hilarious to think about an athlete who gets completely pissed whenever anyone gets the spotlight and not them, and that's immediately going to push them harder and to do even more daring things. Something very useful for an adventurer.
An egomaniac is a wonderful person to run into if you're into that sort of thing. For my trait, I went with number 3. I have a daily exercise routine and I refuse to break it. I just love the idea of there being a surprise attack by a bunch of goblins, and the athlete fighter refuses to start until he's done his morning calisthenics.
As a DM, if the player ever isn't there, I immediately know what the adventure is going to be if they have that trait. Um, Moving along though, over to the athlete ideals. This is just generally just your general ideals, and it's just called something else. But my favorite is number 2, triumph. The best part of winning is seeing my rivals brought low. I don't know why, but it just speaks to me more than any of the others. Simply because of the idea that you just keep on fighting and keep on trying to take down every single monster in your path. It's very evil though, so keep your good guys out of there.
I I chose number 2 as well, partially for the novelty of, for once, there being an evil ideal within a class background, which, from looking over stuff, seems to be very rare. I think it's just, your classic story of, I want to be better than so and so, and they need to bow down before me.
Definitely with you on that one then. In terms of the bonds, well, none of these really stuck out to me as being particularly interesting compared to the others. It has a lot of stuff like your family, your mentor, and all of that. I kind of like the number 2 again. I will overcome a rival and prove myself there better. It immediately gives the DM a different NPC to work with who's going to like be in legitimate competition with your party, assuming that they want to do that. And it can also be another reason why your athlete is sort of pushing himself to be the best that no one ever was.
I chose number 4. I will be the best for the honor and glory of Grayskull. And it I like it because it bakes in a bit of lore, or that you have to work with. Say your country is known for its archers, like Crete was back during, the whole classical era. Is essentially that. You are honoring the glory of the Cretan archers. No, I don't think that's the right phrasing.
Probably not. But I will say that is a very interesting idea. I will say that just in general, all of these bonds generally give you some more stuff to work with, especially for your DM if they do want to include it. Um, Moving on to flaws, I would say that my favorite here is it was really hard for me to pick, but I would say just number 1. I indulge in habit that threatens my reputation or my health. It's really open. You can choose anything from just being a classic alcoholic to being to maybe just adventuring as being that sort of reputation killer, depending on the grimdark level of your game. It really just kind of depends on how bad you want your character to act in one part of their life and what that part of their life is. And I think that that is a really good flaw to have.
I went with number 1 again, indulging in a habit that threatens reputation or health. And for this character, was thinking maybe, since the Olympics are coming around and somehow Russia got found doping their athletes again, thought it was topical.
Oh, you absolute monster. Um, but just to say, I'm just gonna make a note of this. For number 1, well, just flaws in general. I think that all the flaws in this list are really solid overall. The idea that you'll do absolutely anything to win, that you'll ignore anyone who doesn't compete, and especially anyone who loses to you.
I'm
I
surprised you
mean,
didn't pick that one.
I was very tempted. 4, I have lingering pain from old injuries. That could just be like a very like old soldier archetype, and you could be very grumpy and arrogant about that. And if your failure on my part is because my opponent cheated. I mean, that one's just kind of fun because every single time you lose, you can just accuse them of cheating.
Blame the
And
lag, bro.
what was that?
Blame the lag. It's not my fault.
Exactly. Exactly. It'd actually be kind of funny to use the newer technology on our Arcana in order to like put yourself forward in time, and you're a hacker, and whenever you lose, you just immediately blame the lag on your end for why you couldn't crack the safe. um,
As you can
but either way,
see, the athlete has a good mix of traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws that can form into a very unique character, be it
right.
something a bit more villainous, like what Dan made, or otherwise.
Look, all I could say is I think it's absolutely hilarious to play it. Well, I think the idea of playing an athlete who is nothing but a complete dick to everyone they meet, just under the guise of being the best that no one ever was, is absolutely amazing. Sort of like Schwarzenegger and Pumping Iron.
Another movie I need
Ah,
to watch.
yes, you
Mo-
Philistine.
Moving on to page 128 in the player's handbook, we have the charlatan. Charlatans, they have a way with people. They know what makes them tick. You can eventually tease out almost anything from them that you want, be it information, that nice watch on their wrist, the coin in their purse, whatever it is, you know how to work with it. Useful talent, and it can be used to your advantage or detriment. For skill proficiencies, you get deception and sleight of hand, both fairly good skills to have. You're gonna run into sleight of hand quite a bit from what I've seen in most games, and deception, it's always good to have in your back pocket. For tool proficiencies, you get a disguise kit and a forgery kit. Again, you won't use these often, but when you do, it'll be in a more dire moment. You don't get any languages, but with the set you're already packing, I don't find that to be too much of a problem. And for your equipment, you get a set of fine clothes, a disguise kit, the tools of your con, be it bottles of snake oil, set of weighted dice, marked cards, signet ring of an imaginary duke, and a pouch containing 15 gold, being slightly above average for their monetary gain.
I would generally say that for the entire Charlatan setup, it's a really solid mix of things that all sort of build around this idea of you deceiving people and taking their money. The skills of deception and sleight of hand are really good, and they mix extremely well with the disguise kit and forgery. Like using deception plus your disguise kit and also your forgery kit, you could probably con people for just general permits if they're in a big enough city. And if you use your sleight of hand, you could totally slip that watch off their wrist, just as Sven mentioned earlier. Another thing that I really like about them is the fact that they also list a bunch of favorite scams that you can work with, because even if you don't have an idea of what your schemes would be off the top of your head, it will give you some really good ideas to work with just as a basis.
Personally, I chose number two, shaving coins or forging documents.
I really like number four. I put on new identities like clothes. It really suggests a character who's sort of a classic cultural chameleon who can just go from one place to another and not really be noticed. You go from one after you finish conning everyone one town, you go find another one, and it's just a classic idea of a traveling charlatan or someone who's peddling snake oil.
It's a good, that's a good one as well. I personally hey, find that to be a bit used, but hey, if it's used, that means it's well loved and well worn.
To be perfectly fair, their background feature specifically works with that. So I would say that it's better than whatever you chose. But even then, I really like what you picked.
You're not wrong. Their class feature, false identity, lets them have created a second identity that includes documents, established acquaintances, and disguises that let you assume the persona. Additionally, you can forge documents, including papers, personal letters, and all that, as long as you have seen an example of what they look like and the handwriting you would have to try and copy. I suppose that will either play into the forging documents scam or make it completely redundant, depending on how you run this character.
I mean, depending on how permissive your DM is with your background and such, that could be absolutely hectic. Like, just imagine that at one point in your life you were a servant for a bunch of nobles in the court, and you have a bunch of original documents from like two or three different families. Like, you could probably rip a massive wave of just anger and distrust through a kingdom if you thought it through enough by basically pitting a bunch of different signatures against each other and appearing as a person of three different houses as you sort of swapped identities with enough time.
And if you're really into that, I have a bridge you might be interested in buying. Moving on to personality traits, these are little things that make your rogue maybe not rogue,
Right.
but your charlatan tick. I personally chose number 7, going off of our our friend from the Indiana Jones series, or not Indiana Jones, the Mummy. I keep multiple holy symbols on me and invoke whatever deity might come in useful at any given moment.
I absolutely love this one. It's I don't even know exactly what to talk not exactly what to talk about, but the idea that your character is just such a charlatan that they keep a bunch of different gods holy symbols around their neck under the vague guise that they could trick someone into believing they're of their faith is absolutely amazing to me.
And who doesn't love a good religious scam? You know, the Catholic Church kept it up for quite a few years. For
And
ideals, I went more for the lawful criminal with number 2, fairness. I never target people who can't afford to lose a few coins. Because who doesn't love a Robin Hood figure who just is a bit more questionable in their morals?
for me, I tend to go with something a little more open. I prefer number 6, aspiration. I'm determined to make something of myself. It's obviously not like very strong just on the outset, but depending on what you sort of make of it, it can be a very good ideal because it can be like I want to scam my way into owning a castle using my backgrounds, or I want to be better than what I was before as just a basic charlatan, but I will use my skills to get there.
That is a set of skills to pull out from your bag. Moving on to bonds. These are people that your charlatan will be connected to in certain ways. I chose number 6. I swindled and ruined a person who didn't deserve it. I seek to atone for my misdeeds, but might never be able to forgive myself. Who doesn't love a little bit of self-hatred inside of your D&D character?
Certainly know how to roleplay well. For me personally, I would say that I really like number 1. I fleeced the wrong person and must work to ensure that this individual never crosses paths with me or those I care about. It's a it's a very strong thing for a DM to have from the outset because it immediately gives you an enemy that you can work with, and it also gives you a reason to want to be using your false identity more than your normal one. Or maybe it's a reason you don't want to use your false identity because they hate that person, not you.
You certainly seem to be going for more personal based bonds, where I go for more loosely based ones. Again, it just shows how different you can make a charlatan just using the same backgrounds. And for flaws, we all have them to some degree. And I can't resist swindling people who are more powerful for me with number 5.
For me personally, I would say that I really like number two. I'm always in debt. I spend my ill-gotten gains on decadent luxuries faster than I can bring them in. It's absolutely hilarious to think that your character is always just buying solid gold food or something else that's completely ridiculous just because they can.
Hey, that would work well for a crime lord, maybe. You're secretly in debt, but who cares? As long as you can keep up their persona, everything's fine.
And it's based off several real people.
No matter. Now, moving on, what class works best with each background? We'll be rating these on a scale of 1 through 5. 1 being the absolute best option there is, and 5 maybe not being as good. That does not mean that this disqualifies them from doing so. You can make an amazing blend of anything as long as you put enough thought into it. But this is just surface level.
I personally believe that artificer is not exactly what athlete is trying to do, as artificers are generally just going to be sitting in the background and working on their own machine. Athletics may be something they use, but beyond that, I doubt they're going to get too much use from the proficiencies.
Yeah, as we've seen, artificer, it's definitely a newer subclass and or newer class within subclasses, and it doesn't it just doesn't vibe well with a lot of the options that are brought up in most cases. Next is the barbarian. I would put this as a 1. There is this is the barbarian's bread and butter. It is almost, I think, designed for it with 1 working better in my mind.
I'm very close to you on this one. I would probably note the barbarian as between a 1 and a 2. I think that the barbarian gets a lot of use out of both the athletics and acrobatics, but their land vehicle usage is a little bit more iffy. It really depends if your barbarian is going to be driving carts.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
slight note on the land vehicle proficiency. Personally, when homebrewing this a bit, I would let you switch out the vehicle proficiency for maybe something different depending on what event you favor. But
I'm
that is just a side note.
I'm definitely with you on that one. In the case that they just do horseback riding, though, I would also consider animal handling, just because that is what's used for horses. While technically speaking, you don't use it if you're riding like a chariot or a cart.
Of course.
Moving farther along, though, I would probably put the bard as between a 2 and a 3. In all honesty, their dex their secondary skill is dex, and considering how they can use performance, it could actually make them very good as sort of like almost, I wouldn't say a gladiator type, but an athlete who's more about putting on a good show than completely competing.
I agree as well. Having them maybe be a bit more of a. They're the PR guy who picked up a few skills along the way with the athlete. I would put this one at a basically a 2 as well.
For the next one, though, we do have clerics, and for me personally, I'm probably putting this guy as maybe a four, between like a 4 and a 5. It's probably not the worst, but it because clerics do use strength as usually as their secondary stat, but even so, it really conflicts a lot for the most part.
Yeah, the whole "thou shalt not be vain" thing does get ruined a bit with this. So I agree. A 4 is a bit. 4 makes sense here. For druid, I suppose you could make it work, but I'd go 4 or 5 here. It just doesn't work for me.
I see a unique path that you could take with the druid, where you could potentially have them be like a you could have them be like essentially an animal fighter, and so they spend their time in like kits as sort of like Roman, like kind of imagine Roman gladiators fighting against like a tiger druid rather than just your average tiger. But even then, at best, it's a three in my mind because the skills are just not quite there.
Uh, yeah, they very much could work as a bestiarius style, but that's leaning a bit more into the gladiator side of things.
Certainly true. Moving along though, fighter is actually probably my favorite out of the entire set because they can use absolutely everything. They're probably the most versatile set of fighters out there. They aren't completely bent on just being angry all the time like the barbarian. And so the mix of both dexterity and strength with their proficiencies, along with the use of land vehicles, makes me think that this is just perfect for giving them even more versatility.
Yes, this you could argue that the barbarian is a 2, but I don't think you could argue in any way that a fighter is anything but a 1. This this was custom made for them in my mind. Moving on to monk, it could work. I'd personally put this as like a maybe a 3 or so. You'd have to do a bit of finagling, but you can definitely make this work. Maybe it being a pastime, sort of like the prison handball games, except it's your monastery mud wrestling tournament that comes around every year.
I think that this is probably more of like a two or three, mostly because of the fact that they could very easily fit in as like a boxer or wrestler because of the monk's just straight abilities with unarmed combat. But overall, I am still in a fairly good agreement, just because of the fact that even if you are the Muhammad Ali of Greece, it doesn't exactly change the fact that there are some things in here that don't quite mesh.
Next
Moving
up,
down, oh,
Paladin. It the religious people on this list, it really doesn't work with them. I'm giving it a 3 because you can make it work and it can make sense. It's not like the artificer or cleric, but
you'd be giving out some serious Anakin Skywalker vibes.
yeah.
Moving along, though, we eventually come down to Ranger, which is, in my mind, I would say it would very well be a two, but I would probably put it around three. It seems like it's pretty solid if you decide to go for either like an archery competition or just general accuracy, but there is a lot to be desired still.
Yeah. This would be playing a bit more into your Robin Hood archer style of athlete, not as much your boxer or hand to hand. I agree, low 2, high 3. Next up, Rogue. Again, I guess it could work. Rogues do tend to be a bit more dexterous base than, just strong, which would be,
Or
yeah, more of an athlete, but again, you can make it work. I,
you can.
I'd give this a 3.
Moving along though to Sorcerer, I mean the next three I could probably all combine into one. Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard are the weak links, generally speaking. Unless you're super high level and you can pick up that spell that makes you Hulk out and get a level of exhaustion, you're probably not going to be doing anything close to athletics.
Yeah, I think you might be able to argue that Sorcerer could do it, but yeah, I would put these guys at a 4.
Solid five there. Um, moving over to the Charlatan though, just going from the top of it, I would say that the Artificer definitely could have some really good uses for
Yeah,
this because of your mechanical contraptions would allow you to trick people in ways that other classes just don't get to.
yeah, I agree. I think Artificer is a solid 2. Like you
Yeah,
said, they have ways to work with it, but this isn't served up on a golden platter for them.
yeah, I would say probably a very firm two, maybe a very good three. Um, Bard, in my opinion, though, is a completely different beast. This is one of I think a few different ones for this class because the Bard is just charisma, a bit of dexterity. Just use your sleight of hand, and they're going to be happy to have that disguise kit and be able to make some false identities after they mess with the wrong people.
Yeah. Bard, I agree. This is served up on a golden platter for them. For Barbarian, I think we're in four territory here. It doesn't really work with this more stealth based, stealth and charisma based base that Bard gets, and it's not like athlete where it's a bit more strength and competition based. Yeah,
I, I could see one use for barbarian, which is you have a rogue or a bard in your party who is giving you a false identity and dressing you up so you can enter the city even though you're like this savage nomad. But other than that, I would honestly give it just a five. It seems really antithetical to the kind of trickiness of the charlatan. Moving over though to cleric, I would give this a very solid 3 to 4 because if you're playing a straight cleric, this is a very trickery domain or something that specifically rewards you being deceptive, which is not usually the case for most of the cleric subclasses. And if you wanted to do this otherwise, you could theoretically. Yeah, I think it's at best 3 to 4.
yeah. For for trickery domain, this is easily a one. But for every other one, this this is a 3 to 4. I'm leaning more towards 4 just because. Same thing with the athlete. Thou shalt not lie, and thou shalt not be vain. It just doesn't quite work out.
Following it up, though, I would say the druid is honestly almost somehow worse than the cleric in this respect because of the fact that on top of the fact that they just don't generally have these skills, just even from any of their class features or their subclasses, they also with the way that most druids are sort of set up, they're usually from like outside of the normal space of life, and so they probably don't have a ton of experience policing people for their wares.
Yeah, I I think this is a 4. You can make it work. Maybe have it, you know, the monkey on your shoulder or something, thing that runs over and grabs stuff from a coin purse while you're distracting them. But again, very situational. 4 or 3.
All right, and moving along to fighter, I would probably put this as probably a 3 because you can certainly make it work with a dex-based fighter. Your charisma is probably going. If you don't dump charisma in order to help work with your deception, you're probably going to be working a bit closer with a bad intelligence or wisdom, which would probably work for this. But it generally takes a lot of work. It'll take some more work on your end in order to make something that fits.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you on that one. It can work, but it's not what you would think of. Monk, I personally find this to be a 2 or a 1. I think this, well, not made for it, it just fits like a glove to a certain degree. Your monk just dancing around the street and doing so, slipping coin bags, giving people false fortunes. I think it works lovely.
I'm pretty solid in between 2 and 3 here. I think that like it can somewhat depend on your subclass in some respect, because some will give you a little bit more help with this than others. But I think that with the way that the skills line up in terms of the dexterity, you could probably make a fairly solid charlatan if you're a bit tricky about it.
Next up, Paladin. I think he's in the same boat as Cleric here. It just doesn't personally work out. I'm going with a 4.
Paladin doesn't really even have a trickery domain to work with, so there isn't even like a solid option there. If I did have to put this though, I would say that you could really make some good use out of the charisma stuffs, and so if you were hiding from your church, or you were potentially a Oathbreaker paladin, you could probably do well with this. But it will take some severe holes to jump through. So you're gonna have, and your character's gonna have to have like a few talk with the DM then. So very much in the 4 category, if not 5.
Next up, Ranger. Maybe what I said for Druid with a Beastmaster, but I'm leaning like a. It can work. I'm going 3 or 4.
Put it in a 3. I think the lack of charisma will kind of hurt you in terms of deceiving people, but you can definitely pickpocket people fairly effectively. And like you mentioned with the Beastmaster, that can work very well for you.
And looking
Rogue.
back at some of the options that is available for Charlatan, you could very well make this as, a snake oil salesman selling mythical brews from, a dragon heartstring that you got off a deer a 10 minutes walk outside the wood to cure your male pattern baldness or whatever.
It,
So,
it's certainly a good way to get the items you need and to be able to slip them on people. The big issue is the charisma side of it.
yeah,
In terms of the rogue though,
it's a 1.
yes, it's a 1. I definitely we could go a bit more in depth, and I will just say this: it will basically be giving you everything that you want to be doing as a rogue. But if you're struggling to come up with a way to sort of make this work with your class, it's definitely
That's
there's
on
definitely
you.
other yeah there's it's on you at that point. It's a very solid connection between the two.
For a sorcerer, I want to put this at a 3. It's nothing too special. You can make it work. Maybe be a bit more towards, the noble house hopping side of things, but it's not it's not nothing too extravagant.
I would put this at a very solid 2. The ability to deceive people is very, very nice when it comes to sort of getting your foot in the door when you're doing one of your cons. And subtle spell and like range spell can help you make up for a lack of dexterity by making it basically possible for people to know if you're casting stuff, which means you can like slip things around, cannonball a fine base somewhere in order to distract them. I mean, it does take a bit of work, but I feel like the magic can make up for any lack of dexterity here, and the proficiencies that you need both use charisma.
Yeah, you've convinced me enough to put it at a 2. Next up,
Moving
Warlock. I think that this has huge storytelling potential. Maybe, like, you cheated at a dice game and got, a cursed item out of it that gave you your eldritch power. You eventually switched identities enough that you accidentally irritated the wrong in- individual who just happened to be an eldritch being. I feel like there's so much you can do with it. I'm willing to put it at a 2.
I would personally say that, like with all things, the Warlock is a class that kind of needs an extra bit of care because you need to think about how the patron came to be. There's a lot of stuff that you just have to inherently do that you don't need to do with other classes when you play a Warlock. But if you do it, the Charlatan almost connects perfectly. Like imagine if you scammed your patron out of your pact and now they want to get revenge on you for it. And like you mentioned, what if you got your packed item, your boon, from scamming it off someone or like stealing it, and then suddenly you're now being blessed by the Fae. A Fae warlock with this background could wreak absolute havoc, and it's not even like it'd be that hard for you to really align it because your deception score is already going to be through the roof, and and having a solid dexterity will make you better at initiative. So you won't be a terrible combatant. I
Yeah.
Probably one
And
or two.
finally, our wizard. I feel like this would lean hard into the snake oil salesman or convincing someone that something that is mundanely magical is highly magical and you scam them that way.
I'm really not sure where to put this one. I'm feeling like there is a way to make it work, but I'm pretty solid. I'm feeling like it's a four because like the wizard, the things that you're kind of focusing on are your intelligence and then maybe another stat like constitution.
Yeah.
And I feel like this just doesn't quite have a place in there. But when it comes down to it, you could probably still do fairly well as like, oh, I was a low level sorcerer who would help people in little ways, and if they didn't need magical help, I could give them non magical help and say it was magic.
Yeah. I'd put the wizard at a 3, maybe.
It's there's some hoops to jump through, but I think you could I think there is a gem in there. I'm just not seeing it.
Cool. So, yeah, that was the ranking. The symbols that you are seeing on screen, they were created by a lovely artist who thankfully was willing to let me use them. Their name and links will be all over the description and popping up in the video. Do check them out. They do wonderful work. And yeah, thank you for joining me, Dan. Hope to have one of these out a bit sooner. Until next time, this is Elvin Prince, signing out.